Bonsoir à tous. Je suis ravi de vous retrouver, même si c'est toujours de manière assez dématérialisée. Donc, pour cette séance de notre séminaire consacré aux recherches de provenance sur les collections extra-occidentales, nous retournons cette fois-ci au cours de notre voyage un peu aux quatre coins de la planète vers le continent asiatique et plus particulièrement vers le monde indien ou plus exactement, pour employer une expression que nous connaissons peu en français, vers l'Asie du Sud. En français, on a l'habitude de parler de l'Asie du Sud-Est pour désigner la partie de l'Asie qui correspond plutôt à l'Indochine et à l'Indonésie. Et en fait, on parle plutôt de l'Inde en général au sens historique du terme ou du sous-continent indien, alors que nos collègues anglo-saxons emploient beaucoup plus l'expression qui est plus neutre et qui, à mon sens, gagnerait à être davantage utilisée en France, d'Asie du Sud, donc de South Asia. Et pour ce faire, donc, nous faisons appel à une spécialiste qui est en charge d'une des collections les plus importantes en dehors de l'Asie du Sud, en dehors du monde indien, Sushma Jansari, qui est conservatrice des collections que nous appellerions donc nous d'art indien du British Museum, une collection évidemment tout à fait essentielle, et elle va nous parler plus particulièrement des recherches qu'elle mène en termes de recherche de provenance. Donc, comme cela avait été annoncé, cette séance va se dérouler en anglais. Donc, dans un instant, je vais passer en anglais. Je vous rappelle que donc, à l'issue de cette présentation, vous aurez la possibilité de poser vos questions par le chat, des questions qui seront relayées à notre intervenante. Alors, vous pouvez poser vos questions directement en anglais si vous vous sentez suffisamment à l'aise avec la langue de Shakespeare, ou bien, donc, sinon en français, et nous assurons la traduction. So now I skip to English, and Sushma Jansari, we are very pleased to welcome you this evening. We are 1 hour ahead in Paris, but thank you for joining us. We were hoping to be able to invite you physically to Paris, but it will be for some other time, hopefully. Usually I used to go to your museum, to the British Museum every year. It's been a while now that I haven't been able to go to London. So hopefully in a few months we will be able, even if there's a Brexit now, that we will be able to travel from Paris to London and vice versa. So Sushma, you're a Tabor Foundation curator at the British Museum, and you've done your PhD at UCL, that is University College London. So the topic of your thesis was the relationships between the Seleucid and the Mauryan Empire. So you worked on the relationship between the West and the East in ancient times. So it's a very interesting way also to work on the relationship between the West and the East in more modern times. And in a way, the history of the provenance, the history of the collections is also another way to work on these relationships. And this is something that you focus a lot also, not only on your academic research, but also on your blog, which is called Wonder House, because you're very present, very dynamic online. I guess that Wonder House is a translation of Jadugar, which is the Urdu word meaning for museum. But maybe you will talk about this later. So, but as far as I'm concerned, I've talked too much already, and so I will leave the floor to you and to your presentation. I will come back at the end of your presentation to convey the question from the audience. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. It's very kind, and I'm really excited to be speaking to you, although it's very strange basically seeing myself reflected back at me on my screen. Not how I normally do talks, but I suppose we live in a slightly different world at the moment. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So please do let me know if it's not working or if you can't see it very well. Is that okay? Brilliant. Okay, and also just to let you know, I'm going to be looking over here because although I've got my presentation on my screen in front of me, my notes are all to one side, so forgive me for not looking directly at you. As Vincent very kindly introduced me, I'm Sushma Jansari. I'm the Table Foundation Curator of South Asia at the British Museum, and it's a job I absolutely love. I have fantastic colleagues and amazing collections to look after. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the collections I curate, and I will then explain why I've given you this overview. So I look after ancient to broadly medieval, so 11th to 12th century South Asian collections at the British Museum. And this ranges from the Paleolithic, so that's, about 1 million years ago, all the way to the Indus Valley, maybe 4, 5, 6,000 years ago, and then all the way through early Hindu, Jain, Buddhist sculpture, objects from regions such as Gandhara, Mathura, Sarnath, Amravati, Western India. And in addition to that, I also look after the Sri Lankan collections, which are mostly 19th century ethnographic objects drawn from a single collector called Hugh Neville. And I'm going to be talking about him a little bit later. But I'm also responsible for most of the South Asian ethnographic collections, which include, strangely enough probably, Siberian collections and also the South Asian textiles. But as Vincent mentioned right at the beginning in his very generous introduction, my academic specialism is in ancient history, particularly the Hellenistic era, Northwest and South Asia. And the reason I'm giving you this overview of the collections I curate is to try and make the point that this is such a large and varied collection. And I've had to become a generalist to try and work across this very broad range of material and this quite huge region. And of course, this also includes collecting history. Now, just to also emphasize, like a lot of people, I have not trained as an expert in collecting history or provenance research, and I've had to learn as I continue to learn while I'm doing my job. And different projects have given me the opportunity to work with a very wide range of people and really develop my knowledge base. So I wanted to start by giving you a very recent introduction. I was involved in an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project called Narrative Objects, the Sakha Summer Festival and Cultural Revitalization. The project was developed by Professor Alison Brown and Dr. Tanya Argunova-Lowe at the University of Aberdeen. And broadly speaking, it investigated the ways in which historic artifacts are tools for firstly, contemplating the past, secondly, remembering collective practices of ethnic identity, thirdly, contributing to cultural revitalization, particularly in areas that have experienced political and ceremonial suppression. The regional focus of this particular piece of research was the Republic of Sakha-Yakutia in northeast Siberia, which is in Russia. And the project centered on a unique mammoth ivory model of Isyak ritual, which has been in the British Museum collection since 1867. And I've just now realized I did not include a photograph of this, so my apologies in advance. But as I've mentioned, my core academic knowledge is ancient South Asia. So this region, period and culture was very new to me. But the project was also a superb opportunity to learn more about this particular object and also the wider Sakha collections. So one of the project outcomes was an object in focus book called Model of a Summer Camp, and it was published just last autumn during the height of COVID in the UK and the rest of the world. And I co-wrote this, alongside Alison and Tanya. And my section focused on the collection history of the model of a summer camp that St. Augustus Wollaston Franks acquired from the Russian section of the Universal Exposition in Paris in 1867. So now you know why I started with this particular project and object. I was also asked to write a very general overview of the collecting history of the Sakha collections at the British Museum. And this was published and translated first into Russian and published there. And all of this work also contributed to a new addition to the collection. So I worked very closely with Tanya and my curatorial colleague at the British Museum called Amber Lincoln, and she recently curated the Arctic exhibition. And we commissioned a contemporary model of Isyak carved in mammoth ivory by master craftsman Fedor Markov. And this incredible object was recently on display in the Arctic exhibition. Now, for me, this whole experience was a fantastic learning opportunity and opened up for me yet another avenue of interest and knowledge development. So I'm gradually getting a clearer and better idea of the underlying stories, people, networks, periods, regions, and events that feed into the collection history of large sections of the collections that I curate. But for the main body of this lecture, I'm going to concentrate on two specific projects that focused on better understanding the collecting history of two particular collections. The first is a group of the same type of objects, which is model Gandal, that were mostly acquired by soldiers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the second is a very large and wide-ranging group of objects from Sri Lanka that was acquired by a single individual called Hugh Neville, who was a colonial official stationed on the island. The reason I've chosen these particular case studies is that I was asked to talk about concrete case studies relating to non-Western artworks and the practical aspects of how you go about undertaking this kind of research. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is what I really wish I had known when I was starting out. And also it's a kind of information that's not really written down anywhere as a guide to how you do this work at an institution, but it's what you learn as you go about doing your research. And also, just I suppose it's important to add, the material I'm discussing today is not traditional works of art as art, but groups of objects that represent the reality of the kind of work I actually do as part of my job. And it's not all that often I, or indeed my predecessors, have really focused on the provenance of one particular object. Usually I look at sections of the collection or particular collectors and try to understand the wider context of the life and journey or itinerary of this material. So my lecture today is going to be quite practical, and I hope helpful to researchers or anyone interested in looking in more depth at collection histories, especially at the British Museum. So now I can move to my first slide. There you go. So case study 1. I got my first full-time museum job in 2012, and I was working as a curator for a huge storage move project of the Asia ethnographic collections. It was a pretty intense and very busy couple of years on a short-term contract. I'm sure we're all familiar with those. And my head of department at the time asked me to give a talk to the British Museum's director, who was Neil McGregor at the time, about my work, and with a particular focus on the research I'd undertaken on some of the objects. Now, I was the newest and most junior member of staff in the Asia department at the time, so it's pretty nerve-wracking trying to do this kind of work. And it would have been quite easy just to do something I really knew about and knock it out, and that's fine. But actually, I decided to not do that. I decided to make my life just a little bit more difficult and talk about objects that were quite unfamiliar to me. And I decided to research a small group of wooden sculptures, which you can see in front of you right now. I'd seen them so many times walking through the stores, and I really, really was intrigued and wanted to know more because I'd never seen anything like this in the material culture of South Asia. And as my research progressed, an extraordinary story unfolded where social and cultural narratives linked the ancient easternmost incursions of Alexander the Great, my ancient actual research, with the Kalash people who live in Bumburet, Rumbor and Biria valleys in Pakistan, which is near the border of Afghanistan, as well as British soldiers engaged in the so-called Great Game in the northwestern frontier province. And all of that starts with the humble registration number. Now, registration numbers are, on the face of it, really boring, but I think they are really important, and you have to understand how they work so that they are useful for you. I'm going to start with the one that's in the middle of the screen, which is AS 1930 1023 1. The bit in white, AS, refers to Asia, so this is an object in the Asia department. The bit in a sort of a purpley pink colour is the year of acquisition. The part in yellow, the month of acquisition. And then you have the bit in green, which is the date of acquisition. And then number 1, right at the end, that's the number of each object in any acquisition relating to that particular collection. So if, I don't know, say somebody donates 3 objects, it'll go through AS and then, I don't know, 2021. Today is the 20th, so it would be 0520.1, then the next one will be .2, then .3. So that's how this registration number works. But in the Asia ethnographic collection, if you see a reg number with a Q in it, so here you see, in bright orange, a Q in the middle, that refers to query, and it means that the object has been historically disassociated with its original registration number. So for example, this one, AS 1981 Q45. So the year in this registration number relates to the date an object was found in the collection without its original registration number. Now, during this big move project, I managed to, reassociate quite a few of these Q number objects with their original registration numbers. And it's really great to, work your way through these kind of objects and reassociate them, but it's extremely time consuming and often quite frustrating, as you can probably imagine. And you end up going down loads of blind alleys. But on the other hand, it's also really important. So the registration number is a great jumping off point for more detailed research into an object. You can search for the registration number in the museum's content management system called MI+, and it also has a public facing portal which is called Collection Online. So if you Google British Museum Collection Online, it will take you to that page and you can write down anything you want to be searching for. So if you want to do Gandao, you just search for Gandao and you'll get a whole page of them come up. And what's very helpful on that Collection Online record is actually, it'll also lead you to the name of the donor or vendor of the object. And often there's also a find spot or production place, production date, and a description as well. And obviously this information varies. Some records are much richer than others, depending on how much research has been done on particular objects or collections. But once you have this registration number, you can go to the collection register. Now, these are normally large, pretty big hardback books, handwritten, held by the relevant department in the museum. But it can get really complicated in an institution as old as the British Museum, and it's almost 270 years old. And this is because departments changed. They've never all been the same. Some were merged, some were separated, new ones have been created. So the curatorial remit and the expertise in each department also changes accordingly. And so does, the type of objects that each department had responsibility for. So in the case of these objects, that I'm talking about today, 3 register comments were really helpful in pointing me to a particular region in Asia, to try and locate these objects. And they also provided some dates and context. So one noted, for example, and I'm quoting here, bought in 1898 by donor's brother, Colonel G.C. Hodgson, DSO, 32nd Sikh pioneers from a Muslim who claimed to have taken them from graves. Another one, and I quote again, given in memory of Captain Hector Bethune, 32nd Sikh pioneers. And the third one mentioned, and I quote again, acquired by G.P.T. Dean in 1923 while he was serving with the 14th Punjab Regiment in Chitral. And also, interestingly enough, there was a label attached to one of the figures, a Q number figure, and it just had the word Kafiristan on it. If you forgive me, I'm just going to open the window because it's getting so dry in here. I think my husband has put the radiator on. The joys of working from home. So here we are at the next slide. And from this starting point of that information I just mentioned, I turned to trusty Google. Never discount the joys of Google. And I searched for funerary effigies from Chitral, which is in modern day Pakistan, and also Kafiristan. And I found that carved wooden figures called Gandao, made by the Kalash people in Pakistan, really closely resembled the objects at the museum. So Gandao, you can see in the central photographs here, they are life-sized male and female effigies, funerary effigies, carved from deodar wood, which is a type of fragrant Himalayan cedar wood. And they're often intricately carved, painted and draped with clothing, and the eyes are frequently inlaid with round white stones. You can still see one of those stones remaining in the central image, just next to the gentleman standing next to it. Now, these figures are considered to be imbued with the spirit of the deceased and placed near coffins. They are not exact portraits, as you can see, but generally quite uniform and stylized representations. And there are three different types. You've got standing, seated, and equestrian figures. Male figures tend to be more common than female figures, and they're generally also carved either standing or on horseback. And if a horse has two heads, if it's carved with two heads, it's a really potent symbol of power, and it represents the highest status that can be accorded through a gandau to a clash individual. And similarly, male figures carved wearing turbans denote authority and bravery. By contrast, women tend to be depicted seated on ornately carved chairs, wearing caps and four horns. And it's also important to note at this point that Kalash funerary culture is very distinct from that of their Muslim neighbours. And a number of anthropologists, including George S. Robertson, who authored The Kafirs of the Hindu Kush in 1896, and more recently, Peter Parks, who completed the most significant and comprehensive work on the Kalash people, have shown that they have a very distinct way of life. They speak their own language, produce their own unique material culture, including their style of dress. And they also practice their own unique religion and rituals, which are strongly influenced by ancient Hindu Vedic religion and rituals. And as I mentioned before, the Kalash live in three different valleys. They're Bumburet, Rumbur, and Bire in the Chitral district of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan. And this used to be called Northwest Frontier Province in Pakistan, and it borders the Afghan Nuristan province. Now, the Kalash remote mountainous homeland, it really contributed to their relative immunity from historical waves of religious change. The same was not true of polytheistic communities in neighbouring Nuristan, when the past had belief systems, rituals, and festivals, a number of cultural aspects in common with the Kalash people. And this changed in 1895 to 96 when Emir Abdul Rahman Khan, the so-called Iron Emir of Afghanistan, oversaw their enforced mass conversion to Islam. Now, up to this point, these communities were referred to as Kafirs, unbelievers, and the land in which they lived was called Kafiristan, land of the unbelievers. And it was only after their religious conversion that the Emir renamed them Nuristanis, enlightened ones, and the land was called Nuristan, land of the enlightened ones. And within this context, British control of Chitral at the time meant that the Kalash escaped the Emir's attempts to convert them. But returning back to the objects at the museum, there's a really major difference between the gandau that I've just been talking about and the objects at the museum, and that is of size. Now, as you can see here, the gandau are life size, but the ones at the museum are between about 40 and 56 centimeters in height. Now, the Kalash also carved smaller human figures, and if you see the photograph on the far left-hand side of the screen, this is one of the examples, and the smaller ones were carved to place on top of shrine posts, but a careful examination of the museum objects gave no indication that the museum's figures had ever been part of a shrine post. But instead, it seemed that the models of these larger objects had a very different function in the culture of the Kalash community. And the reason why these particular objects were valued by the British soldiers was also unclear. And until you know that, you can't quite get at the moment of provenance. You don't know how or why they're required. So at this point, a document and some photographs in an ethnographic document, or ethdoc for short, associated with a group of three figures came in very handy. Now, onto the practical aspect. Before I tell you about the content of this ethdoc, I ought to explain what it is, because it took me quite a long time to figure it out. Now, all of these wooden figures were previously held among the collections of the Museum of Mankind, which housed the British Museum's Department of Ethnography from 1970 to 1997 in Burlington Gardens in central London. Now, when it closed in 1997, all of the objects were moved to the British Museum storage facility in Osman Road, then then to Blythe House, and finally back on site to Bloomsbury in the new World Collection and Exhibition Centre. They also moved from the Department of Ethnography to the Department of Asia, and that's why they have so-called eth docs associated with them. Now, these documents were kept in the Anthropology Library and Research Centre and not transferred physically to the Department of Asia or the Museum Central Archives, which are entirely different archives. Now, going back to this eth doc associated with 3 wooden sculptures, you can see the 3 wooden sculptures on the side. There's a reference to eth doc 1721 in Collection Online, and a lovely colleague called Jim Hamill, who works in the ALRC, was able to find it for me. Now, this file related to 3 figures donated by Captain Sully and included a letter and some photographs that came with the figures that he had donated. Now, the letter noted, and I'm quoting here, 3 genuine replicas of funerary effigies from Kafiristan, probably no longer obtainable. Pardon me. Made for me by the Kafirs of Bomboret, Chitral in 1915/16 for photographs taken by me of full-sized effigies, please communicate. I assume there was some later communication because, as you can see, there is a photograph of a full-size figure in one of the photographs that's in this file. And the reference to a commission of replica Gandao made by Kalash people in Bomboret Valley, Chitral, accompanied by a man carrying replica Gandao that looked the same size and type as the ones we now have at the British Museum, was really compelling. And it looked as though these figures were being made specially for sale and were not a part of pre-existing Kalash material culture. And I also found more of Captain Sully's photographs, here we go, at the Royal Geographical Society website on their online collections. I contacted them, but they didn't have any other objects associated with Captain Sully, so it seems that he donated his objects to the British Museum and the photographs, at least the majority of his photographs, to the Royal Geographical Society. At this point, I also looked at the other donors of these figures because I really wanted to know if it was mostly soldiers in Chitral who were commissioning and buying these objects, and quite an interesting pattern emerged. So the 4 earliest examples of these objects in the museum's collection were acquired by Colonel G.C. Hodgson and Captain Hector Bethune, both of the 32nd Sikh pioneers during the relief of Chitral in 1895. And after this campaign, the men actually accompanied Sir Francis' young husband on the British expedition to Tibet, where Bethune died and where Hodgson was awarded the Edward VII Distinguished Service Order. So the 4 figures you can see on the screen they travelled from Chitral to Tibet, then to India before actually arriving in London. And we've also seen that 3 figures were made for Captain Sully. And of the 4 remaining objects in the collection, 2 were also acquired by soldiers in this region, Lieutenant Colonel G.P.T. Dean, who served with the 14th Punjab Regiment in Chitral in 1923, and Major General S.H. Powell, founder of the Indian Signal Service. Now, the acquisition information for the final 2 remains really vague. One was donated by H.G. Beasley, who's a very important collector of ethnographic objects. And there's also a label associated with that last object, with a Q, with a query object. And that just notes it was acquired in Kafiristan in 1936. So that's all the information we have for those 2. Now, it's quite clear that these were overwhelmingly acquired by soldiers, but why? Why were they, carting around these wooden sculptures across the subcontinent? And why were they commissioning this material? Now, obviously, military personnel stationed in this region would have the opportunity to commission, buy, or even simply take objects, but they chose to commission small versions of Kalash funerary effigies from local Kalash craftsmen. I spent some time researching 19th and early 20th century British ideas about the Kalash people, and I think I might have found the answer. And unexpectedly, but happily, it linked with my own core expertise. So the Kalash have various stories about their history and origins. Interestingly, some claim descent from Alexander the Great and those of his army who settled in ancient Arachosia, Gedrosia, and Bactria. And the story of a lost Hellenic people in these northwestern regions of the subcontinent have been repeated many times over many, many years, including famously here by Rudyard Kipling in The Man Who Would Be King, published in 1888, but also turned into quite a famous movie featuring Sean Connery and Michael Caine. And there's also been an interesting recent genetic study published in 2015, and it's overturned these claims. There is no genetic evidence linking the Kalash people with European ancestry from Alexander, his soldiers, or anyone else. So the narrative has clearly come from an outside source, since it was clearly not handed down through Kalash oral tradition. And it's interesting that this claim has been accepted and spoken about by some Kalash people. And then you go back to those ethnographic studies that I mentioned by Robertson in 1896, and another one called by H.W. Bellow, who wrote an inquiry into the ethnography of Afghanistan, published in 1891. And it revealed that actually at that time, the Kalash made no such link with Alexander the Great. In fact, it was Robertson, the ethnographer, who made the link. And given this connection, I think it's this historical background and the Kalash people's perceived and externally imposed genealogical link with Alexander that seems to have made their artifacts, especially these martial figures in these Gandal, so interesting to the soldiers who acquired them. And the perceived link between the Kalash people and Alexander was part of the nexus of assumptions about the region, which informed British soldiers in the late 19th and early 20th century. And also, the men who acquired them were from the British officer class, whose education would have emphasised Greco-Roman history, making them particularly susceptible to stories linking their empire with that of Alexander. And it was most probably this entirely invented mythology surrounding the origins of the Kalash, which attracted the British soldiers, officers rather, to these objects, because perhaps for them, the objects embodied a palpable link with their illustrious predecessor and conqueror of the region that they themselves were in the process of dominating. But I think what's also quite interesting about this type of commissioned work in small-scale sculptures is that it's continued through to the present day. And Ramat Wali is a contemporary sculptor living in Kalashgram village in Rumbur Valley, Pakistan. And he makes his living now from carving these Gandal and traditional funerary effigies, but also wooden sculptures as souvenirs and works of art in their own right. So as you can just see briefly through this case study, it's really helpful to start with the documentation, see what sort of information is there to help you start your research journey, and also collaboration is really important. I don't think I could possibly emphasize that enough. I was helped by some really brilliant colleagues in the UK and Pakistan. Tom Crawley, who was a curator at the Horniman Museums, now at the University of Cambridge, and he helped connect me to Luke Ramat, who's the founder and chief executive officer of the Kalash People's Development Network in Pakistan. And I also received help from Zulfikar Ali Kalhoro, who's an anthropologist and assistant professor at the Department of Development Studies in the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. And Zulfikar actually pointed me in the direction of the information about the sculptor Ramat Wali as well. So I suppose it's taken you from a couple of labels all the way through to connecting with different people and then constructing the story in between. As there are so many different aspects that go into it. Now, the second case study is completely different. It's a piece of research that I'm still working on, so this is by no means complete. But I think it gives some insight into how unexpectedly rich stories and connections emerge surrounding a person and collection, as well as the multiple institutions that are connected through particular connection. So don't always assume that, if you've got a collection in one institution, that the same type of object or the same collector is not represented elsewhere. They may well be. So who is this collector? Who am I talking about? Well, unlike the previous study, this one focuses on just one individual and an enormously varied collection. And it's because of the size and range of this collection that I decided to start with the collector rather than the objects themselves. So this is going to be the focus for this particular case study. Also, I think it's worth noting that, like the previous case study, the research arose from the collection, the storage move project that I mentioned right at the start. And I really, really want to emphasize how important it is to spend time with and get to know the collections you work with, so you really understand what is there. This includes the type and range of objects, what kind of condition they're in, are there points of similarity across the collection or differences, even what kind of stickers or labels are attached to or associated with the object. And all of this very detailed looking will gradually help you build up a picture of what is there, but just as importantly, what is missing. And these are points I'm going to go through as I talk about this case study. So going back to that storage move project, those ethnographic, Asia ethnographic collections were broadly organized by country and region. And there was a whole section just on Sri Lanka. But within that collection, I was really intrigued because actually most of the material was from just one collector, which is very unusual. And all of the objects seemed to be mostly ethnographic, but slightly different because there were drawers and drawers full of multiple examples of very similar small wooden containers, ladles, wooden ladles, wooden spoon racks, betel nut containers, betel nut cutters, and so on. And I was really curious to know a bit more about this, because why was one person collecting the same type of so many, quite simple, basic objects? And the opportunity to research this more came when I was working on the Houghton Gallery refurbishment. And I really wanted to include a specific section on Sri Lanka, which I did. And I turned to the Neville collection to help me do this. And while I was doing this piece of work, I found that actually very little research had been conducted on Neville himself or his collection of objects, but considerable research had focused on his extensive manuscript collection, which is now at the British Library, but was formerly held at the British Museum. So who was he? As you can see, I've not tracked down any photographs of him. I haven't the faintest idea what he looks like. But what I do know is that Neville spent his entire adult life working as a civil servant in what was then British Ceylon. He arrived there in 1865, was appointed private secretary to the Chief Justice. And from this starting point, he rapidly climbed the administrative ladder, and he held positions across the length and breadth of the island. And I think this is quite useful to know because it means he must have come into contact with a very wide cross-section of the local population, as well as the European colonial community. And also that his work took him the length and breadth of the island, from Bitikaloa in the east to Colombo in the west, Jaffna in the north, and Gampala in the centre, and many, many other places besides. And it's also clear that by such wide-ranging travel across the island, he would have had the opportunity to collect a wide variety of objects. And I have to say, he was also very heavily involved in the cultural side of British colonial society in Ceylon at the time. In the year he arrived, in 1865, he was elected a member of the Royal Asiatic Society Ceylon branch, and he held various posts in the society and made regular contributions to the journal until 1883. And these reflected his very broad interest. So this is not just confined to objects and manuscripts, but they actually range from geology to ornithology, which is the study of birds, and history. It was pretty much everything, which was a bit unexpected. But Neville was also involved in the Kandyan Society of Arts, and this is a society that still exists today. It's called and the art historian A.K. Kumaraswamy, who I'm sure many people know, he actually mentioned Neville in his medieval Sinhalese art, published in 1908, in connection with this society. And he wrote that the society was set up in 1882 by those interested in ancient artwork, and under Neville's supervision, quote, the services of the best workmen in silver, brass, and pottery were employed in making articles of Kandyan art and workmanship. Now, this society was supported through income from annual subscriptions paid by members and also by purchases made of these art objects. And I'm really keen to investigate the link between Neville and this society more closely, because the bulk, and I mean the vast bulk of this collection, is made up of lots and lots and lots of particular types of art objects, including containers, betel nut accoutrements, all of which date to the 19th century and all very closely resemble the type of objects that were made by this society. And I've very little doubt that further research in this area is most likely to reveal that Neville acquired many of these pieces from the craftsmen employed by the Kandyan Society. But the reason why he acquired so many of the same types of objects is really not clear. He may well have wanted to sell them on to individuals, society, museums across the empire, and to other European collections as well. But another source of really useful information, you can see a photograph of it on the right hand side. In 1885, when he was still in Ceylon, Neville established a new journal to which he himself contributed most of the articles and also edited, called the Taprobanian here. Now, it's a very wide-ranging journal, and it has his own journal is basically filled with a prolific number of mostly quite brief articles and notes about his own research interests and his own collections. And given the overall composition of this work, he may have felt that this was the only outlet for the full range and extent of his work. But unfortunately, his journal was short-lived, and after just a few short years, the flurry of articles came to an end. Now, I did mention this work is ongoing, but libraries have been mostly closed for the last year, so I haven't yet been able to look more closely at the Taprobanian, but a brief glance reveals that actually we can get quite a lot of insight into Neville's work. He shows himself to be familiar with current scholarship, displays his interest in a wide range of objects and subjects, from Sinhala nursery rhymes to coins and everything in between. It's also interesting in this journal that the scholarly network in Ceylon in the 19th century also becomes clearer. So Neville had links with a number of very prominent figures who shared his interest in Sri Lankan history and culture, such as H.C.P. Bell, who was later the first archaeological commissioner of Ceylon. And I think it also emphasizes that his interests were very varied, and they clearly informed what he acquired. And in this acquisition of knowledge and objects, he was greatly helped by his knowledge of local languages and the network of contacts that he'd made and cultivated among the local population, as well as fellow Britons. And I think actually a more detailed look through this publication, when I can finally do that, is likely to be very revealing in terms of his collecting. And also, I think there's probably potential to reconstruct those parts of his collections, including his coins, for example, that are no longer in any of the known existing collections in the UK. I do appreciate that this slide looks a little bit random, but there is a reason why I've included rocks and shells. So when I first came across Neville, I found that hardly anything was known about him. There's a bit of information in Somadas's catalogue of his manuscripts, but otherwise pretty much nothing. So I wanted to know a bit more about him and also his family background, and this proved really fruitful. So according to the census, Hugh Neville was one of 8 children born to Mary and William, who's a hosiery merchant. Some of the siblings, they travelled across empires, settled in different places from New Zealand, Ceylon, India. And there's a really strong collecting link between Hugh and his brother Geoffrey, and Geoffrey is the one who went to India. One of their brothers, Ralph, stayed in England to study architecture under Sir George Gilbert Scott, who's a very famous architect here. And it's through Ralph that the British Museum and other institutions acquired many of Hugh's Sri Lankan collections. Now, I found that Hugh's family had a very long-standing interest in collecting, and many were also active members of learned societies like the Society of Antiquaries. And to give you a couple of examples, Hugh's father had a particular interest in meteorites and minerals and was elected a fellow of the Geographical Society. The reason I'm mentioning all these different societies is that they often hold archives and collections. So if you want to know more about one of their members, they are a great place to go. They may well have material that other people have overlooked, missed. It may not be published yet. So always explore them, always get in touch, because they're likely to have some really interesting things. Now, Hugh's father, William Neville, I mentioned he is quite interested in collecting meteorites and minerals, and for most people that might involve attending an occasional meeting of their society, maybe exploring the geology of surroundings, collecting some mineral specimens, but not William Neville. He formed a collection of meteorites and minerals that was so large and important that he sold them to multiple museums, many of which made their way to the Natural History Museum, and they are in fact so important that they are now listed alongside those of Hans Sloane, whose collections formed the founding body of the British Museum, and Sir Arthur Russell. And the story of Hugh's brother Geoffrey is quite similar. He worked for his father William, and when he started to become ill, the family sent him to Calcutta, and you sort of wondered, did his family not like him much? Because the death rate there was really very high, and if you're ill anyway, this is not going to bode very well. But anyway, he ended up working as a librarian at the Indian Museum in Calcutta. And on the way there, he formed a massive collection of shells from the Cape, Mauritius, and the Seychelles. And he actually worked very closely with Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. So these are like seminal figures in natural history at the time. And he also collaborated with his brother, Hugh. And it turns out Hugh had also formed a significant collection of shells. And I actually checked the British Museum collection. We don't have that kind of material from him. But instead, I found that 390 lots of natural history objects, including shells from Hugh's collection, was sold at auction in 1904. This is about 7 years after Hugh had died. I think it's probably his brother Ralph who sold these. And with all this in mind, I think it's, highly unlikely that Hugh arrived in Sri Lanka and suddenly thought, hey, I need a hobby. Maybe I'll join a society and start collecting and dabbling in some research. I think actually it's way more likely that he'd already planned to do these things on arriving in Ceylon, and he may well have already started to make contacts in advance of his journey to the island. And just to add something that I uncovered last year, the family was also connected to Edward Lear. And I don't know if anyone knows the poem The Owl and the Pussycat, but this is the author of that particular poem stayed with Hugh Neville in Sri Lanka at the time. And it's probably from him that Hugh got his interest in the study of birds, because he collected a lot of those as well. Now, just to give you a very, very brief overview of the type of objects in Hugh Neville's collection, you can see this. It's a whole range of material. There's a couple of small, model reliquaries, tiny little rock crystal ones. You've got some tiny copper and bronze alloy figures of the Buddha, Tara, but this is a tiny proportion of his collection. Generally, the Buddhist objects here are mostly 18th and 19th century figures of the Buddha in bronze, brass, ivory, stone and wood, and also model stupas in very similar range of materials. A couple of copper alloy Hindu sculptures, but very few of those as well. Various objects associated with ritual vessels, offering bowls, temple bells, lamps, amulets, and it's not yet clear if these can be linked with specific religions and traditions, something I'm really hoping to look into at some point. There's a whole range of material associated with Saniyakama rituals. These are rituals that aim to cure illness through dance and offerings. A whole load of Sri Lankan manuscripts in the British Library, but also the accoutrements of like writing these, from styli, sheaths, cases, inkwell, knives, decorative buttons, lots of personal ornaments, but nothing blingy. You think of Sri Lankan, you think of the most beautiful gemstones, but this is all glass and paste. There's nothing spectacular here. It's all very everyday. Some textiles, very basic stuff, lots of agricultural materials, coconut scrapers, spoon racks, serving dishes, architectural decoration, weapons, knife handles, and also a couple of objects from Japan and China. But it's very wide ranging, but not spectacular. It's not the most spectacular stuff that you might imagine. So I'm going to do something a bit cheeky in a lecture about provenance and skip to the dispersal of this material, because I haven't been able to access any of the documents I need to in order to look at the provenance. I have not been able to travel to Sri Lanka last year. I've not even been able to travel to a library to read his journal. So I'm just going to go to what happened afterwards. So in 1897, after about 30 years of working for the Ceylon Civil Service, Neville left the island for the last time, travelled to France and on the Côte d'Azur in France, and it was apparently quite popular with the British at the time. But unfortunately, soon after his arrival, he died on April the 10th, 1897. Now, he actually took his manuscript collections with him to France, and we've got quite a lot of handwritten notes written by him there on the Côte d'Azur. And then they brought over to London, but it's not clear who did this or exactly when. And after they're being first held at the British Museum, as I mentioned, they then were transferred to the British Library. But it's not clear at all what happened to his collections. It's not clear if he took those with him to France or if they went straight from Sri Lanka to the UK. I actually recently managed to obtain a copy of Neville's will. Now, in the UK, wills from 1858 are on the government website, so you can do UK wills, and then you'll find a particular website. You type in the person's name and the date of death, and a whole load of names will come up. And for about £10, you can buy a copy of that, and you just download it. For pre-1858, you go to the National Archives website, and you can, for free, if you just sign up, you can download a copy of any will, and it's been scanned in. But the writing is really, really hard to read for those pre-1858 wills. So I just warn you, because I've tried and I've failed. So Neville's will, which is at the top, that was signed and witnessed in Colombo on Valentine's Day, 1897. And it was witnessed, his executors were his brother Ralph and his cousin Hubert. And I'm just going to quote the first part of the will, because I have to say it was a bit unexpected. This is the last will and testament of me, Hugh Neville of the Ceylon Civil Service. I hereby revoke all wills heretofore made or executed by me. I give and bequeath to my son Hugh Lewis Neville all my family china, that's like the crockery. And I give and bequeath to my daughter, all the shares of the rest, and reside of my china, reserving to my wife, Alice Blanche Neville, the personal use and enjoyment of the whole of my said china during her life, or so long as she shall continue to be my widow. And I have to say, I don't know very much about 19th century wills, but a lengthy discussion about the fate of the family china was really not what I had expected to find. And the only part that may allude to his extensive collections was this tiny part: all the rest of and residue of my property of whatever nature or kind soever the same may be, I give, devise and bequeath to my said son and daughter absolutely in equal share. Now, given how much time and energy Neville would have invested in his extensive collections, I find it very, very strange that it's not mentioned in his will. And I'm assuming, he must have worked with his brother or family to disperse it or dispose of it. It's really not yet clear. I also traced the family tree, and there's wonderful websites called findmypast.co.uk, and you can trace family trees really, really well there. And I actually found his great-granddaughter, who's Lady Linda Marcole, and she actually now lives in Kenya, but unfortunately she didn't know of any of her great-grandfather's surviving objects or papers, but she very kindly replied to my emails, which was very nice. And it turns out actually there was a fire in Florence Court, which was the family's seat in Northern Ireland, that was in the 1950s, and a lot of the family papers were thought to have been lost at that time in the fire. But the National Trust is now responsible for that property, and they have a really useful website. It's always being updated, and it has lots of the objects that are in particular houses, any documents and things like that. So that's also quite a valuable resource. And so very quickly, what happened to his collections? Why am I talking about that bit? Well, actually, it's really unusual to be able to reconstruct the whole process and personalities involved in offering, receiving, and dispersing an entire collection across a range of museums in the 19th century. And I'd not expected to find any of this information. But there are really useful archives at the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum, the V&A, and it permitted me to do exactly that. And a really interesting picture emerged of the links between museums in England, Scotland, and Ireland, and their desire to obtain rare material from Ceylon. And it's quite interesting that this hope was not always echoed by the more senior staff at these institutions. Now, Ralph stored these thousands of objects in his offices in the City of London. It's about a 20-minute walk from the British Museum. And weirdly, I used to live directly behind that. So it's a very strange link. It made my eyes pop open. But in the autumn in 1897, which is soon after Hugh Neville died, his brother Ralph wrote to Charles Hercules Reed, I've put pictures up for people, who's keeper of the Department of British and Medieval Antiquities and Ethnography, and he offered to sell Hugh's collections to the museum for £300. So at no point in this exchange of letters does Ralph say anything about his brother's will, or even what Hugh's intentions were for this collection after his death. So it's not clear if he's carrying out his brother's wishes or not. But soon afterwards, Reed wrote to Caspar Purdon Clark, director at the South Kensington Museum, which is now called the V&A, and suggested that they share these collections. So Purdon Clark at the V&A would buy about half the value of the collection for his museum, and then Dublin or Birmingham Museum would share some of the rest. Now, the division of the collections was not arbitrary. So when you look at the museum, as you will all know, they have different purposes. So for the British Museum, they acquire a whole, like an all-embracing selection of objects that span human history, including religious and ethnographic material. The South Kensington Museum, now the V&A, focuses on decorative arts and design, as did Dublin Museum at the time. Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, it was a smaller collection, but much more wide-ranging, and it reflects Birmingham's very important industrial heritage, so manufacture of jewellery, fine metal goods, and things like that. And it's interesting because as you go through this archive, you actually have the letters and telegrams sent between these people saying, hey, I'll meet you at 12 o'clock on Friday to look at the collection. And that's exactly what they did. And there was a flurry of letters and activity. And there was also lots of other letters going back and forth between Dublin and Scotland and London and Birmingham. Now, the curator from Birmingham, apparently he felt ill. He wasn't able to go to the collection and they decided to just exclude him. So Birmingham didn't get anything. But actually, Purdon Clark chose 320 objects for the V&A and Dublin, and Clark, another curator from Scotland, he chose 226 objects for Edinburgh. And also Purdon Clark wanted any ethnographic material that Reed of the British Museum didn't want. And there's all these sort of negotiations that gradually unfold. And it's really quite interesting. And after seeing the objects, Purdon Clark actually, commented to his colleague at the British Museum saying, why is this price that his brother wants so low? And he even says, and I'm quoting this bit, I estimate the total value of the 527 objects Mr. Walter Clark and I selected to be at least double the £150 we've been asked to pay. But the executors of the late Mr. Hugh Neville fixed a very low price of £300 for the entire collection. Now, we've no idea why they did this, but I have to say, if I had a small office space and it was filled with thousands and thousands of my brother's objects, I may do the same thing. So that may explain it. And it's also interesting that the family didn't really value or have any interest in Hugh's collections, because there's something in the letter that his brother wrote to the curator at the British Museum saying, there will be a heap of little boxes, jewellery, etc., that I fancy of no use to you and would as well be left behind. But if you prefer the lot, by all means take them. If you are sure not to want them, it seems simpler to leave them. They are, I expect, of no value, but will serve the family as knickknacks and mementos. So zero interest in his family's collection, or rather his brother's collection. And in the event, the result of Ralph selling this collection so cheaply was that national museums in London, two national museums in London, the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin and the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, were each able to purchase a large number of objects from this unique collection for a very low price. And there's even information in this archive about how museums at the time, this is very early 20th century, collected, packed, transported these newly acquired objects. So it's fascinating. I'm going to quote something in full here, actually. This is Reed's report to the trustees, because I think it very succinctly explains the importance of the collection in and of itself, as well as the museum, and also gives an accurate overview of the whole collection. So he wrote, "The ethnographical and Buddhist collections made by the late Mr. Hugh Neville during a residence of many years in Ceylon, the series from Ceylon in the museum, both in the religious gallery and the ethnographical collections, are singularly poor, and this large series will go far to render them more worthy of the museum. The collection contains many hundreds of objects, including both ancient and modern religious figures and utensils and paintings, masks used by devil dancers, carved ivories of ancient and more modern date, personal ornaments, domestic utensils, and a remarkable series of toys and objects used in games. It would be a very difficult matter to make such a collection, except by a long stay in the country." So I think the survival of this particular archive at the V&A and the British Museum means we get a really detailed insight into the way these curators decided to divide up the collections and acquire them for their own institutions as well. And also the lists permit the reconstruction of the collection before it was broken up. And also it's quite interesting. This bit I also hadn't quite expected, but the correspondence also speaks to the very close association and spirit of collaboration between the staff at these institutions. And there are very long-standing personal and professional links between these figures too. And I also wonder about Hugh's longer-standing links with the British Museum, because something I also recently found, and I mean a couple of months ago, that Neville himself had personally sold some objects to the British Museum. For example, 2 Chinese plates that were found in Sri Lanka in 1892, and a whole load of animal skeletons and fish specimens to the natural history section of the British Museum. So there's quite a lot of things going on, and still a huge amount to do, particularly about provenance. But I just want to sum up and briefly outline why I think this is quite an interesting area of future study. Now, one of my primary aims through my research into Neville and his collections is to understand, and particularly as a curator, adjust for the intellectual bias that may have informed collections made during, in this region and period by a British colonial officer. For me, this is particular relevance because I recently curated the ancient to medieval South Asia displays in the Houghton Gallery that I mentioned, including one on Sri Lanka. And many of the objects in our South Asian collections were acquired during the colonial period. And in his quite recent study of the early phase of British rule in Ceylon, for example, Sujit Sivasundaram argues that the British undertook an unfinished process of partitioning the island from the mainland, or islanding the colony, and so emphasized its Buddhist and Sinhala character. And as part of this colonial approach, as Sivasundaram contends, the British recycled traditions derived from Kandy, a kingdom located in the highlands of Sri Lanka. Now, this really important study can be an excellent stepping stone to developing an understanding of the acquisition and use of Sri Lankan material culture by British colonial officials. That is, to understand the process of collecting as part of the creation of a vision and narrative for the country, both within Ceylon and also abroad. The Neville collection at the British Museum and elsewhere presents a unique opportunity to explore the role that the formation of collections played in the process of islanding Sri Lanka, and also the enduring vision of an islanded Ceylon in museums today. And, to give you an idea of what I'm working on right now in relation to the Neville collection, I've been searching out and thinking about the natural history specimens that he collected to get a better idea of his fuller collections. and also to think about how the antiquities and ethnographic objects fit into these wider collections. Because I'm increasingly wondering if his approach to collecting antiquities and ethnographic material was broadly modelled on his acquisition of natural history specimens, collecting the multiple examples of types, or at least an example of each type of object. And given the overall makeup of his collections at the British Museum, this actually seems to be a very real possibility. And the other point I've been thinking about is how interested was Neville really in his non-natural history objects? I wonder if actually he wasn't actually as interested in them as we might assume, because when you start to look at his publications, his overwhelming focus is aspects of natural history. And this is also what his father and brother were interested in. And even the Taprobanian, that journal that I mentioned, he had free reign in this. He was the editor, he'd published his own journal, and he chose to write about natural history and local stories and language, but actually very, very little about his historical and ethnographic objects. So obviously I need to look at the wider Sri Lankan collections at the British Museum and think about how Neville's collections fit into this material, and also how he fits as a collector. But there's also that really important point of local connections in Sri Lanka itself when he was living and working there. He simply could not have acquired what he did without at least some links with the local communities. So as you can see, I've started this research and given you an idea of where I'm finding the information in archives held at different institutions, primarily in the UK. But it's really only half the story, i.e. what happened after the objects arrived here. There's still quite a long way to go, and I clearly need to spend a lot more time going through documents which I've been told are held at the National Archives in Colombo. And hopefully I'll be able to travel there at some point in the next couple of years. And I think I'll just stop by saying that, the research that I do is not just my research. Actually, I have two students, collaborative doctoral project students, who are looking into two very different aspects of provenance and collecting history research. One is looking at South Asian collectors at the British Museum, and the other one is looking at women collectors represented in the South Asia collection. So this is not just me toddling around doing little bits and bobs of research. There's quite a lot of other work going on around me as well. And there I will draw it to an end. Thank you very much indeed.